Kellan Jameson returned from deployment, dreaming of quiet nights and a future with his wife, Avenleigh, only to discover the life he was fighting for had been shattered by the two people he trusted most, his pregnant wife and his own stepfather, Arden Graves. Sergeant Kellan Drayton stood on the edge of the tarmac, the scent of jet fuel still heavy in the air, his boots hitting familiar American soil for the first time in 8 months. The welcome committee was small, just family, a few neighbors, and a couple of old friends holding signs that read, "Welcome home, Kellan." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His mind was only focused on one person, his wife, Avenleigh. They had married just a year before his most recent deployment. Their wedding had been simple, a backyard ceremony under golden string lights, her lace dress swaying gently in the breeze as she promised to wait for him. That promise had kept him going through dust storms, late-night ambushes, and the constant pressure of survival. He kept a photo of her in the chest pocket of his uniform, worn and creased from being folded and unfolded so many times. When he finally saw her standing by their red Chevy truck in the parking lot, his heart skipped. Avenleigh's auburn hair was pulled back in a bun, and her eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses. But something was off. She wasn't running to him, wasn't smiling wide like she used to. She stood there, frozen, hands wrapped protectively around her stomach. That's when he noticed it. Her belly was round, undeniably pregnant. Too pregnant. Kellan's smile faded. The calculations were instant. He had been gone 8 months, and by the look of her, she had to be 6, maybe even 7 months along. His boots suddenly felt heavier, and the noise of people greeting their loved ones blurred into the background. He kept walking toward her, each step slower than the last, and as he reached her, she barely whispered his name. Her hug was brief, mechanical, and lacked the warmth he had longed for. They drove home in silence. Avenleigh stared out the window, fingers fidgeting in her lap, while Kellan gripped the steering wheel, jaw clenched. Their cozy bungalow hadn't changed. The same wind chimes hung near the porch. The flower pots were still lined neatly along the windows, and the welcome mat still said, "Home sweet home." But stepping inside, it felt like a stranger's house. Kellan's duffel bag hit the floor with a dull thud. He scanned the living room, eyes lingering on a pair of baby socks on the coffee table, a crib partially assembled in the corner, and a baby shower invitation pinned to the fridge with a magnet. None of this had existed when he left. There had been no mention of pregnancy in her letters, no phone calls hinting at any surprise. He remembered the last care package she sent, a book, some snacks, and a handwritten note that ended with, "I can't wait to start a family with you when you're back." That had been 5 months ago. Confusion turned quickly into suspicion. He noticed changes he hadn't expected. There were new photos on the mantel, ones that didn't include him. Avenleigh's smile in them felt hollow, forced. In some, she wasn't even looking at the camera. In one, someone had clearly cropped out the person standing beside her. The cropped hand on her shoulder, the awkward space beside her, it all screamed cover-up. He tried to ignore the rising panic, tried to believe there was an explanation. Maybe a miracle. Maybe he was wrong. But deep down, he knew. That baby wasn't his. And Avenleigh knew that he knew, even without him saying a word. She busied herself with the kitchen, cleaning dishes that were already clean, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. She barely looked at him. That night, he lay awake, in their bed while she pretended to sleep beside him. The sound of her shallow breathing, the way she kept her back turned, it all ate away at him. He stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, replaying every memory from the last 8 months. Every lonely night, every moment he'd wished he could hold her, talk to her, even just hear her voice. And all that time, someone else had been doing those things in his place. The next morning, he walked through town to clear his head. The local coffee shop owner gave him a free drink and thanked him for his service. An old classmate stopped him at the gas station and told him he looked good, but her eyes shifted uncomfortably. when she asked how Avenleigh was. Even the pastor's wife at the grocery store asked about the baby with a tight smile, as though testing his reaction. It was all there, in their eyes. Everyone knew. The betrayal didn't feel real yet. It sat in his chest like a weight, heavy and shapeless. Kellan returned home, but he didn't go inside. He sat in his truck for over an hour, staring at the front door, remembering how excited he'd been just days ago. How he had practiced what he'd say to Avenleigh. What kind of dinner he'd cook for her first night back. How he would surprise her with the antique bracelet he bought at a market in Kabul. Now that bracelet sat in the glove compartment, untouched. The silence between them stretched across the next few days. No explanations came. No apologies. Just a heavy air of secrets and guilt. Kellan wanted to ask, to scream, to demand answers, but something inside him told him to wait. If she had betrayed him, if this pregnancy wasn't just an accident but a full-blown affair, then she wasn't alone in the blame. And if someone had taken advantage of her loneliness, someone close enough to be trusted, then Kellan needed to know who. The truth, he feared, would be worse than he imagined. And he was right. Kellan Drayton sat at the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees, staring blankly at the floor as the ceiling fan hummed above. The baby items scattered around the house had become daily reminders of the betrayal he couldn't yet prove, but couldn't stop feeling in his bones. Avenleigh's silence made things worse. Her refusal to explain, to even acknowledge the obvious, forced Kellan into a quiet rage that simmered just beneath the surface. He no longer looked at her the same. Her every move felt like a performance, her every smile artificial. Something irreversible had changed between them. One evening, while Avenleigh was out at a prenatal appointment, Kellan stood in the kitchen, staring at a calendar pinned to the fridge. He flipped back to previous months, tracing his deployment timeline against the rough estimate of her pregnancy. His chest tightened with each turn. There was no possibility, no miracle. The baby wasn't his, and the truth was staring him in the face. Still, he needed more than just math. He needed facts. Undeniable, scientific truth. The next morning, without saying a word to Avenleigh, Kellan drove 2 towns over to a private clinic. He paid in cash, using a portion of his combat bonus. The staff explained the process. A non-invasive prenatal paternity test could be done with a simple blood draw from Avenleigh and a cheek swab from him. The clinic would handle the rest, but getting Avenleigh's sample would be the hard part. He didn't want to confront her, not yet. He had no plan, but desperation made him creative. Later that week, he offered to take her to a prenatal checkup, claiming he just wanted to be supportive. She agreed, almost nervously, as though unsure of his intentions. At the clinic, while she waited for the doctor, Kellan spoke to a nurse privately and explained everything. With discretion, the clinic collected the necessary blood work. The nurse nodded as though she had seen cases like this before. The sample was sent to the lab, and Kellan was told to expect results in 7 to 10 days. Those days dragged on endlessly. Every moment at home felt suffocating. Avenleigh avoided eye contact. She spent hours rearranging baby clothes, watching television with the volume too high, or sitting outside staring into nothing. Kellan noticed how she flinched when his footsteps got too close, or how she left the room whenever he entered. They were no longer a couple. They were strangers, trapped under the same roof, each hiding their own truth. On the 9th day, the results arrived in a sealed envelope. Kellan didn't open it right away. He sat with it for hours, staring at his name printed neatly on the front. Eventually, he walked to the shed behind the house and sat alone, away from her, away from the noise. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope and scanned the page. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Probability of paternity, 0%. He read the sentence 5 times, then again, just to be sure. There was no margin of error, no doubt. The baby wasn't his. The breath left his lungs, and the paper slipped from his hand onto the floor. His worst fear had been confirmed. But what came next was even worse. The test included a note. Data suggests close genetic relationship between alleged father and biological father. Potential first-degree relative. Kellan's mind spun. A first-degree relative? That meant the baby's father shared close DNA with him. A brother? He had none. A cousin? No one close enough. His stomach turned and the realization hit him like a thunderclap. His stepfather, Arden Cole. Arden had been married to Kellan's mother, Callista, for over a decade. Though not blood-related, Arden had stepped into the role of father figure when Kellan was still in high school. He was a quiet man, well-liked around town, known for fixing cars and helping neighbors without being asked. Arden had always been present, offering advice, helping Kellan move into his first apartment, even standing beside him as best man during his wedding to Avenleigh. The betrayal went beyond infidelity. This was something deeper, something twisted. Suddenly, moments that once seemed innocent came rushing back with new meaning. The times Arden visited the house while Kellan was away, the nights he dropped by to check on Avenleigh, the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching, the tension in his voice when Kellan mentioned coming home early. The puzzle pieces fit together now with painful clarity. Kellan's fists clenched. Anger burned hot in his chest, but beneath it was grief. Grief for the marriage he thought he had, for the trust that had been shattered. He didn't confront Avenleigh that night. Instead, he sat alone, gripping the test results, wondering how long they had been lying, wondering if Arden had manipulated her or if she had chosen him willingly. It didn't matter. The result was the same. Everything he thought was real had been a lie. By the next morning, Kellan's instincts as a soldier kicked in. He began collecting evidence. He searched phone records, email accounts, even old social media messages. He found a burner phone in the back of a closet, hidden in a shoebox filled with old receipts. The phone was filled with texts between Arden and Avenleigh, secret meetings, hotel confirmations, photos that left no room for doubt. The affair hadn't started in his absence. It had begun months before his deployment. Kellan's hands shook as he scrolled through the messages. Arden had sent long, romantic texts, calling Avenleigh his, and referring to Kellan as an obstacle. One message read, "When he leaves again, we can finally be together." But Kellan hadn't left again. He'd come back, just in time to catch the truth unraveling. He stared at the screen, feeling the final pieces of his world collapse. Everything had been stolen. His wife, his future child, his trust, and now even his sense of family. But Kellan wasn't the type to break. He had survived war zones. Now he was. The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Kellan stood in front of the bathroom mirror, his reflection blank and hollow. He hadn't slept. His mind was consumed with the betrayal that had sunk its claws into every part of his life. The paternity results, the burner phone, the messages. There was no longer any room for denial. Arden Cole, the man who had stood in as a father, had taken more than just Kellan's trust. He had taken his wife, his unborn child, and every piece of peace he had left. Despite the boiling rage beneath the surface, Kellan didn't lash out. He didn't scream, didn't throw things, didn't demand answers. He operated with quiet, deliberate movements. His military training had taught him that battles are not always won with brute force. They are won with strategy, patience, and precision. And now, Kellan was preparing for war. He started documenting everything. He took photos of the burner phone, captured every message, and backed up the contents to a private drive. He printed out the paternity results and hid copies in different locations. If anything were to happen, someone had to know the truth. Kellan wasn't just heartbroken, he was cautious. Arden had always been calm on the outside, but Kellan had seen glimpses of something darker lurking behind the man's polite smile. Now, he couldn't shake the feeling that this betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated. He installed a hidden camera in the living room, not out of paranoia, but to gather more proof. He needed to know if the affair was still happening, even now. Avenleigh's behavior remained distant and uneasy. She avoided conversations, stayed in her room longer than usual, and took phone calls in the backyard. Her belly was growing, and with it, so was Kellan's sense of urgency. 3 days after installing the camera, he reviewed the footage late at night. What he saw shattered whatever was left of his patience. Arden had been to the house while Kellan was out picking up groceries. The footage showed him slipping in through the back door, the same door Kellan thought was never used. Avenleigh greeted him quietly, their interaction tender and familiar. There was no remorse in their body language, only comfort, secrecy, and shared guilt. Kellan saved the footage and stared at the screen long after it ended. This wasn't just a fling, it was a relationship. It had been nurtured in the shadows while he fought for his country overseas. The betrayal wasn't spontaneous, it was ongoing, thriving behind his back. He made a decision the next morning. He would confront Arden first, not Avenleigh. If this relationship had any root in manipulation or deceit, he had to understand the scope of it. Arden needed to face the consequences before any emotional outburst clouded the facts. Kellan drove across town to Arden's auto repair shop, where the older man was alone, working on a car. Kellan watched him for a moment from the truck, disgusted by how normal he looked, like nothing was wrong, like he hadn't destroyed a family. Kellan didn't say anything when he walked up. He handed Arden the sealed paternity results and watched the man's face shift. Arden opened the envelope, scanned the contents, and his expression changed from calm to pale disbelief. He looked up, but Kellan was already walking away. No words were needed. The truth had spoken for itself. Kellan left him standing there in silence, letting the weight of what he'd done settle in. Later that evening, something shifted in the house. Avenleigh approached Kellan in the kitchen with tears in her eyes, her hands trembling. She tried to speak, but Kellan handed her a printed copy of the text messages and photos from the burner phone. Her face went white. She backed away slowly, realizing there was no longer a way to spin the truth. Kellan didn't ask why she did it. He didn't want her excuses, didn't want to hear about loneliness or vulnerability or confusion. He had seen too much, felt too deeply. The emotional bridge between them had crumbled and there was no repairing it. She left the kitchen in silence, and Kellan knew the walls between them would never come down again. But the damage didn't end with just betrayal. The fallout began spilling into their lives like an oil spill seeping through every corner. Neighbours began whispering after Avenleigh started showing up at stores with Arden instead of Kellan. Rumours grew. Kellan's mother, Callista, found out and collapsed from the shock. Her marriage unravelled just as quickly, and she moved in with her sister. Out of state, Arden, meanwhile, kept a low profile. He stopped showing up to family events and avoided eye contact with anyone who crossed his path. His business took a hit as word spread. Clients cancelled appointments, and his once busy shop became a ghost town. Kellan didn't say a word to anyone about what had happened, but the truth had a way of leaking through silence. Despite the emotional wreckage, Kellan kept his composure. He continued documenting everything. He met with a lawyer, preparing for the inevitable divorce, and made it clear he would not be listed as the father on the child's birth certificate. The lawyer advised him to seek a restraining order if things escalated, especially if Arden tried to provoke a confrontation. Kellan wasn't afraid, but he wasn't reckless either. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he had ended up here, a decorated soldier betrayed in the one place he thought he was safest, home. He had lost more than a marriage. He had lost a version of his life that he could never get back. Every plan, every hope, every vision for the future had been built on a foundation of lies. But there was one thing he hadn't lost: his sense of control. While the others moved through guilt and fear, Kellan was already planning his next step. This wasn't over. Not yet. And if Arden and Avenleigh thought they could live in peace after everything they had done, they were about to learn what it true. A week after Kellan confronted Arden, the atmosphere in town had completely shifted. What was once an unspoken betrayal within one household had begun unraveling into a full-blown scandal. Kellan remained silent, never publicly addressing what had happened, but somehow the truth seeped out. The neighbours grew colder toward Avenleigh, and customers no longer trusted Arden with their cars. Whispers followed them wherever they went. Even strangers gave them strange looks. In a small town where everyone knew everything, secrets didn't stay buried for long. Kellan had been methodical in how he processed his pain. There were no outbursts, no desperate pleas, and no final conversations to find closure. He had already accepted there would never be any. The only clarity he needed came from facts, proven deceit, documented evidence, and a betrayal that could never be undone. But what began as emotional damage was now turning into something more sinister. The deeper Kellan looked into Arden's life, the more disturbing pieces he found. While organising old paperwork to separate joint assets, Kellan stumbled across some unsettling financial records. Arden had been moving money between accounts that weren't in his name. Large sums had been withdrawn over the past year. When Kellan cross-referenced dates, he noticed a pattern. Several of the withdrawals aligned with times he had been deployed. It looked like Arden had been supporting Avenleigh behind his back, paying for things Kellan never authorized, rental cars, expensive clothing, weekend trips. But it didn't end there. A storage unit under a false name caught Kellan's attention. At first, he hesitated to investigate, unsure of what he might find. But curiosity and the growing suspicion pushed him forward. He visited the unit, using a copy of the key he quietly obtained from Arden's keychain the day he visited the auto shop. Inside, it was like stepping into a second life. Photos of Avenleigh and Arden together, baby clothes, a crib, and even a framed sonogram that had Arden's name printed beneath it. They weren't hiding an affair anymore. They had built an alternate life, waiting for the moment to make it permanent. Rage pulsed through Kellan's chest, but he kept his expression blank. He took pictures of everything, his hands steady, documenting. Yet another layer of deception. This was no longer just about infidelity. It was a full-fledged plan to replace him. The child, the relationship, the secrets. They weren't spontaneous mistakes. They were steps in a calculated transition, one that had started long before Kellan returned home. Back at his house, the tension thickened. Avenleigh no longer tried to apologize or explain. She stayed in the guest room, avoiding Kellan's gaze whenever they crossed paths. Their once warm home had become a battlefield of silence. The air between them was cold, filled with unspoken resentment and unfinished wars. Kellan said nothing, but he knew it was time to force a final move. He filed for divorce quietly, ensuring the papers were served while Avenleigh was at her prenatal checkup. She returned home to the documents sitting on the kitchen counter, along with a separate envelope containing all the evidence he had gathered, the messages, the burner phone logs, the surveillance footage, and the photos from the storage unit. There was nothing more to say. Kellan had laid it all out in black and white. The lies were no longer deniable. That same night, Arden tried to call Kellan. The call went unanswered. Then another and another. Finally, he showed up at Kellan's doorstep, pounding on the door, shouting apologies into the empty darkness. Kellan never opened it. He simply watched from the upstairs window as the man who had once pretended to be family finally cracked under pressure. Arden stayed outside for over an hour before finally walking away, defeated. But Arden's spiral didn't stop there. The fallout from his choices began crashing down faster than he could manage. His business license was suspended after an audit, revealed several fraudulent invoices, likely tied to his hidden spending. He was evicted from his apartment 2 weeks later. Even his younger daughter from a previous marriage, Ember, cut all contact after learning the full truth. Arden had traded everything for a secret affair and now found himself completely alone. Avenleigh, too, began to unravel. Her friends disappeared one by one, uncomfortable with the nature of her affair. Her social media accounts were flooded with hate-filled comments and questions. She deleted them all in a matter of days. The isolation grew worse as her pregnancy progressed. With no support system, no husband, and a public image in ruins, she became a ghost in her own home. Even the Haichi doctor at her next appointment asked where her partner was. She didn't answer. Meanwhile, Kellan stayed focused. He moved into a small apartment across town and let the house go into the early stages of a short sale. He didn't want to hold on to the memories that came with it. The divorce proceeded without resistance, from Avenleigh. There was nothing left for her to argue. Everything had been proven beyond a doubt. And Kellan had no interest in child support or visitation rights. He wasn't the father. He never had been. The only thing he did request in the divorce was a clause preventing Avenleigh from contacting him in any way, under any circumstance. She signed it without hesitation. But even as Kellan tried to rebuild his life piece by piece, the darkness lingered. He couldn't help but wonder how long the affair had truly gone on. Had it started before he ever deployed? Had he unknowingly walked into a trap the moment he said, "I do"? The questions stayed with him like shadows that refused to leave. Kellan had always believed that betrayal was something that happened to strangers, to people who didn't see the signs, but he had seen nothing. No warnings, no suspicions, and maybe that was the most painful part of all. The weeks turned into months, and the storms surrounding Kellan's life gradually calmed on the surface. The house he once called home was sold off quietly, and the divorce finalized with a cold stamp of closure. His name no longer appeared on any paperwork tied to Avenleigh or Arden, yet the emotional residue clung to him like smoke after a fire, impossible to fully escape. While he had carved out a quieter life across town, there was no denying the deep fracture that now existed in his perception of trust, love, and even family. Kellan spent most of his time working double shifts at a local veteran outreach center. The job gave him structure, purpose, and enough distraction to avoid thinking about what had happened. But every now and then, something would break through his well-guarded calm. A commercial for baby supplies, a passing couple holding hands, or even the sound of laughter that didn't belong to him anymore. He didn't miss Avenleigh. He didn't miss what they had. What he mourned was the lie he had believed in, the life he thought was real. One night, after a long shift, Kellan received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he answered. On the other end was Ember, Arden's daughter from his previous marriage. Her voice was quiet, nearly trembling. She told Kellan she had found something he needed to see, something that went beyond the affair, beyond the lies. Reluctantly, he agreed to meet her the following day at a cafe far from town where no one would recognize them. When they met, Ember slid a small flash drive across the table. Her hand shook slightly as she explained that after cutting ties with her father, she cleaned out the home he had been evicted from. Among the clutter, she found a hidden camera device buried in an old shoebox. The contents were sickening. Arden had been recording videos in Kellan's home long before the affair was exposed. He had installed tiny surveillance cameras in the bedroom, bathroom, and even inside Kellan's private study. What Ember found on the device was not just about the affair. It suggested a disturbing obsession. Arden had watched everything, from personal moments to conversations, tracking Avenleigh's life even when she was alone. Kellan took the drive home, unsure if he was ready to open it. When he finally did, what he saw forced a new kind of grief into his heart. The footage confirmed that Arden hadn't just stumbled into a relationship with Avenleigh. He had orchestrated it. He had been watching, listening, waiting. There were clips of Arden entering the house when Kellan was away, speaking to Avenleigh in hushed tones. There were videos of him flipping through Kellan's deployment letters, mocking the contents. And worst of all, there was one recording from months before Kellan's final deployment. A quiet conversation in which Arden told Avenleigh he would take care of her while Kellan was gone, because he always knew it would be him in the end. The reality hit Kellan harder than any punch he'd taken in combat. The affair wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't born of weakness or loneliness. It had been groomed, nurtured, and fully manipulated. Arden had treated the entire situation like a game, moving pieces around while pretending to be a part of Kellan's family. He had studied Kellan's habits, invaded his space, and plotted his downfall like a man obsessed with control. Fueled by a mix of disgust and purpose, Kellan made copies of the footage. He sent one to Ember, who promised to take it to the authorities. Another he saved in a private safety deposit box. He didn't want revenge. He wanted accountability. Arden's actions weren't just morally bankrupt. They were criminal, illegal. Surveillance, manipulation, and potentially coercion could carry weight in a courtroom. The final straw came when Ember messaged Kellan a week later with an update. Arden had fled town. No one knew where he had gone. He had emptied what little remained in his accounts and vanished without warning. Kellan knew he would never get an apology, never face Arden man to man again. But knowing the truth, seeing the full scope of the betrayal, gave him the clarity he had been missing. He now understood that what had happened to him wasn't just personal. It was predatory. As for Avenleigh, she gave birth in the middle of a lonely spring night. Kellan found out through an anonymous post on a local forum. She had moved into a shelter just before the baby came. Arden's abandonment had left her destitute. No family, no friends, no support. The child, innocent as it was, entered a world shaped by deception, betrayal, and shame. Kellan felt no joy, no sadness, only numb acceptance. He would never meet the child. It wasn't his responsibility. He had done his part and been discarded. The rest wasn't his burden to carry. In the months that followed, Kellan took steps to completely disappear from the past. He changed his number, closed his social media accounts, and relocated again, this time out of state. A fresh start. No reminders, no ties. He didn't run from what had happened. He carried the lessons, the pain, and the warning signs deep within him. But he refused to allow it to define his future. Every so often, when the nights were too quiet, he would lie awake and replay the entire ordeal, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. Trust is earned, family isn't always sacred, and love, when taken for granted, can rot into something poisonous. Kellan Jameson didn't get a dramatic ending, no closure wrapped in apologies or reconciliation. What he got was survival, a chance to walk away stronger, more cautious, and unwilling to ever be a pawn in someone else's game again. And sometimes that was enough.